All, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of our friends, clients, and associates around the world. We truly have a global representation out there. Welcome to Interfor International's briefing on Pakistan and India situation. We have an illustrious participant here as well in the form of Bob Grenier. But before we start and before I kick it over to Jeremy of Interfor Academy, I'd like to take a moment to let everyone know that we will also have an exciting session next month on June 4th. We will be inviting Mark Sullivan, the former director of the U.S. Secret Service, to join us in a discussion about social media threat monitoring, politically motivated violence, and a lot of the situations and occurrences in the post-Mangione United Healthcare assassination. So that's also going to be very dynamic, and we'll be covering a lot of ground with that. It'll be hosted by Jeremy as well. But with that, thanks again for joining us, and I will be turning it over to Jeremy. And before I jump, everyone, please ask your questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. There's also a chat function. We prefer the Q&A so we can see it all in one place. But please take the time to ask your questions, and we'll be sure to get to as many of them as possible. With that, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Don. I appreciate that. And hello, everybody. It's great to be with you wherever you're dialing in from, anywhere around the world. I'm very excited to have a conversation with my friend Bob Grenier. There's very few people I could think of that I would rather talk to about the India-Pakistan situation than Bob. Let me give you a little bit about Bob's background. Bob worked at the Central Intelligence Agency for 27 years. Bob's storied career saw him on the doorstep of history for much of his time with the CIA. As station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan, on 9/11, Bob was directly involved in the early stages of the war on terrorism, as he recounts in his essential memoir, 88 Days to Kandahar. Bob finished his intelligence career as the head of the Counterterrorism Center, overseeing all U.S. counterterrorism efforts around the world. Today, he remains engaged, providing advice and assistance to governments, corporations, and NGOs in the Middle East and South Asia. Hi, Bob. How are you today?
I am very well, thank you, and very pleased to be here. Thanks for your typically generous introduction. Let's start with just a very brief review of the recent events that I think have brought us here today in the first place. I'll try to be very brief and sort of present things in a broad outline that will then provide us with the opportunity afterwards to drill in a great deal more detail as people may want us to do. But this most recent episode between India and Pakistan began on the 22nd of April with a very unfortunate terrorist attack. And I say a terrorist attack as very narrowly defined because it was a particularly brutal one, and it was focused on Indian civilians. They were tourists, and they were selected precisely because they were Indian Hindus. This took place at a place called Pahalgam, a tourist site in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And it precipitated what I would describe, unfortunately, as a rather typical sequence of events, because we've seen analogous a series of escalations take place as high-profile terrorist attacks have occurred in India over the past 20, 25 years. So it began with shelling across the so-called line of control, which is the armistice line, the de facto border between Indian and Pakistani-occupied Kashmir. Both sides began to probe the other's air defenses using drones. That's a new development in South Asia. And then we began to see the typical economic and diplomatic recriminations. The Indians suspended the so-called Simla Accord, which ended the 1971 war, which suggested a possible reopening of military hostilities between the two. The Indians also withdrew formally from the Indus Waters Agreement of 1960, which controls the sharing of water between India and Pakistan. And obviously a very, very serious issue, and more so under current circumstances because of global warming and all the rest. But everyone was waiting with bated breath to see if the Indians would launch military operations, as they have done several times in response to terrorist attacks in the past. And sure enough, it began on the 7th of May with the so-called Operation Sindoor. The Indians began with attacks on what they described as terrorist targets. They were associated primarily with two Pakistani militant groups that have been heavily involved in Kashmir in the past, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. And then the question was, well, how will the Pakistanis respond? And since they don't have corresponding terrorism targets on the other side, what will this look like? And I was very concerned when the Pakistani response was to launch attacks on Indian military bases, because then you begin to wonder, well, where is it going to go from here? And sure enough, that the Indians did respond with attacks on Pakistani military bases. At the same time, there were continuing attacks with drones, air-to-air battles between Pakistani and Indian military aircraft, which curiously took place with neither side's aircraft violating the airspace of the other. They were firing back and forth with air-to-air missiles across the international border. And as I say, I was particularly concerned at this point with reciprocal attacks on military bases, because that then held the threat, I felt, and I'm sure many others did as well, that this could escalate further into an all-out military confrontation, with the possibility potentially of triggering a nuclear war. But after 3 days, on the 10th of May, there was a ceasefire that was declared after conversations between the directors of military operations on the two sides, in response in part to international involvement. There were messages to both sides that came, from the Gulf countries, and most prominently from the U.S. Hard to say precisely what influence the U.S. had in all of this. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. But fortunately, it was a ceasefire declared, and although it has been rather indifferently observed on both sides, continuing firing across the line of control, things seem to be under control, at least for the moment. So, as I mentioned obliquely before, there was a pattern to this exchange that we have seen in the past. And without going into a great deal of historical detail, as we all know, since 1947, there have been 3 wars between India and Pakistan. 2 of them were primarily focused on Kashmir. But I think the dynamic in which we are still very clearly mired today began essentially in 1989. And that was when there was the start of a spontaneous political uprising in Indian-occupied Kashmir as a result of repression of Kashmiris. In fact, the approximate reason at that time was Indian fixing of an election in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And as I say, that was an indigenous uprising, but into which Pakistan very quickly began to insert itself. And they were able to do that relatively easily because a number of religiously motivated militant groups in Pakistan had been actively involved for the previous 10 years or so in the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan. And so with the end of the Afghan war in 1989, those militant groups were able to quickly shift operations to aid the militants in Indian Kashmir. And over time, as the Kashmiris had losses through attrition with the Indian security forces, the insurrection was essentially dominated over time, and came to be dominated over time by the Pakistani militants. And the degree of Pakistani involvement in attacks, to include serious terrorist attacks, I think has waxed and waned over time because of the political needs of the moment. But as I say, we've seen a number of high-profile attacks which have led to military confrontations as a result. And the fact that these attacks have been seen in the context of the global war on terrorism, particularly since 2001, I think has lent a greater, has made it more likely that these confrontations will spin out of control. And so, again, don't want to go into a lot of historical detail, but there was a very high-profile one in December of 2001 when I was the station chief in Islamabad. There was a militant attack on the Indian parliament, led militaries of both countries to fully mobilize. They were standing chest to chest on the border for, I believe it was 5 months. And we very, very nearly came to an all-out war. In fact, it was U.S. shuttle diplomacy that was led by the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, which I believe was the main reason for both sides eventually to stand down. We then had the famous attack by Lashkar-e-Taiba in Mumbai in 2008. That didn't lead to a military confrontation for a number of reasons that we could talk about, but it certainly carried the threat that it would. There were other high-profile attacks, particularly in 2016 against the Uri Army base in India, and then in 2019 at a place called Pulwama, which led to Indian air attacks across the line in Pakistani-occupied Kashmir, which led to the downing of an Indian jet and the capture of an Indian pilot. And so really ever since then, and I guess really for the last 25 years, essentially, we've had a very, very tenuous situation where militant groups under very loose control by the Pakistanis, as well as others that are perhaps operating without Pakistani support, at any given point, can precipitate attacks to which both sides are likely militarily to respond. And if anything, I'm even more concerned about the opportunity both for military confrontations and for the threat that those confrontations can escalate out of control now more so than even in the past. And the reason for that is, I think, because of political changes that have taken place in Indian-occupied Kashmir. In 2019, the Indian constitution was changed. Indian-occupied Kashmir had a special status under the Indian constitution. That was changed to bring the region under direct control from New Delhi, which has been seen as a great provocation both by Muslims in Kashmir and also by the Pakistanis. And since then, there's been a change in Indian law, which has allowed Hindus more easily to move into the area to obtain land, to start businesses. And that is seen as an attempt on the part of a Hindu nationalist government to try to change the demographic quality or character of Indian-occupied Kashmir. So if anything, that has made the situation even more fraught and tenuous. Also, I'm very concerned, as I mentioned before, that more and more the confrontation is seen as being a rather simple one of terrorist attack and counterterrorism response, when in fact there is a much more complicated dynamic that's taking on that really has a great deal to do with repression of Muslims in Indian-held Kashmir. And I think that is becoming even more incendiary as a result of the Hindu nationalist policies that are being pursued by Prime Minister Modi. On the Pakistani side, I'm also even more concerned, in part because of the turn that Kashmiri politics has taken. The most powerful man in Pakistan, the Chief of Army Staff, individual by the name of General Asam Munir, he, unlike his recent predecessors, is very much religiously motivated, religiously orientated, and where, for instance, his immediate predecessor, General Bajwa, was very much, first of all, understood and acknowledged that Pakistan is not going to regain Kashmir, that they have to find some way to climb down, and was taking at least tenuous moves to try to move in that direction. Asam Munir has very much moved in the opposite direction, and if anything, is ratcheting up the rhetoric. And I think that he has been further encouraged to do so and to strike, if you will, sort of a Muslim nationalist pose, partly in response to the policies that we just mentioned that are being promulgated by Prime Minister Modi. And then finally, I'll mention that we're in a very difficult situation in terms of the domestic politics in Pakistan right now. Pakistan Army has always been a domestic political force. Often, in fact, more frequently than not, they've tended to work behind the scenes. Now, however, they are very much aggressively out in front. They're not trying to hide their hand at all. They have arrested, as we all know, the most popular politician in Pakistan, Imran Khan, and they have very aggressively and very publicly been suppressing the political opposition. That is not at all popular among the vast mass of Pakistanis. And so, if anything, it increases the pressure on the Pakistan Army in order to justify its domination of domestic politics, to show at the same time that they are supporting national security interests vis-a-vis India. So if anything, it has caused them, I think, to be even more aggressive in the Indian context. So I guess with that as maybe an overlong introduction, let's maybe drill into these different aspects of this as perhaps Jeremy you see fit.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that excellent summary, Bob. There's a lot to unpack there, and time permitting, I want to get back to the questions of religious influence and nationalism on both sides. What I want to do now is just ask you a couple of quick questions here. I'm mindful, in particular, of the group that I can see we have with us today. I know so many of the people who are with us think about business associates, plans they have in South Asia. So I would encourage anybody to ask, specific questions in the Q&A section. We'll do our best to answer those. My mind, and I know Bob too, because we're friends, tends to drift towards the international relations aspect of all of this, the historical side. So we'll temper that a little bit to make sure we're getting very practical information to everybody on here. But let me drill down a little bit more on what you just shared and talk about outcomes of this, latest round of the conflict. I'd love to hear from you about how you're viewing the outcome here and what you're hearing from each side about how they're viewing it. One analyst said that, India seemed to come out ahead, that they seemed aggressive and assertive. They struck deep into Pakistan on sensitive military targets, which sent in a really strong message and increased deterrence. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that I proved his country's superiority over Pakistan. Others are pointing to Pakistan's creative use of drones, which, as you noted, is the first time in this conflict. And a lot of Pakistanis are claiming that they did, really well in this conflict. I wonder if you could briefly kind of summarize your view on that and what you're hearing.
Yeah, I think the outcome has not been at all clear, quite frankly. I think very clearly Prime Minister Modi and the Indian establishment writ large very much want to establish deterrence, as you've said. And I think that for them, a satisfactory outcome would be one where they had demonstrated, at least to their satisfaction, that the Pakistanis were in a very inferior military position, such that they would not dare not only to attack India, but to allow anyone sheltering within Pakistan to engage in that sort of activity. It would that the Pakistanis, frankly, had that sort of control over militant groups that are based on their territory. They don't, which makes the situation particularly dangerous. But also, I think if the intent was to reestablish clear deterrence, I'm not at all sure that it did that. I think it demonstrated to the Pakistanis, as to everyone, the dangers of an open-ended conflict between the two countries. But I certainly don't think that it lessened Pakistan's belief in its own ability to defend itself, at least in the short term. So if I don't think that it has reestablished a clear deterrence, if that was the intent. And actually, I think that I'm sure that military analysts around the world are going to be trying to ferret out just what happened in these tactical exchanges. What did it demonstrate about the relative capabilities of Indian Rafale aircraft versus the Pakistani J-10C, the Chinese all-purpose fighters that seem to be the mainstay of the Pakistan Air Force right now. But I'm not sure that there's a clear outcome there. And frankly, again, there are others who are much more well versed in military affairs than I am, who may see this differently. But if anything, I was a little bit surprised at the extent to which the Pakistanis were able to hold their own.
Excellent. Yeah, that's I think over the coming days and weeks we'll be hearing a lot more about that, and maybe some clarity on whether the Indians actually did lose two planes. I know they're not really denying it, but the Pakistanis are making a lot about that. Um, a lot of the questions that are coming in kind of are reading my mind, I think, a little bit. So that's
Mhm.
good. All some similar things in mind, but I want to continue to drill down on how this kind of ended here, and the question of influence on these two countries. Both Pakistan and India are noted for not having a really robust military industrial base. They rely on foreign partners for much of their military equipment, and you highlighted the Chinese relationship with the
Mhm.
Pakistanis and the Indian relationship with the French with their planes. So because of that, an extended war would lead them to be influenced by outside parties to keep them armed. So
Mhm.
but traditionally, the Pakistanis have been willing to accept mediation, but the Indians haven't. And I think we saw that here, even in this case,
Mhm.
where the Pakistanis were thanking the Americans for their
Right.
mediation. The Indians didn't even want to talk about it. So,
That's right.
interested in that. I also want to, especially in the interest of time, because we're getting so many questions, I kind of want to combine your take on that question of influence and how both sides work in that way. But I also wanted to, bring it back to our domestic moment here in the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance was quoted earlier last week saying that this is none of our business, which I think was actually quite a shocking thing to say. But then he very quickly changed his tune. And this is where I think it's very interesting talking to you, because apparently he was briefed on some piece of intelligence that really scared the White House very deeply and led them to
Hmm.
in more directly. So, Bob, I know it's been a while since you've sat in those chairs at the CIA and been a part of those sensitive briefings. But I wonder if you could put your spy hat on or monocle or whatever it might be, uh, and give us a sense of what you think the White House heard about preparations for war or anything like that. So if you could combine that, the U.S. side of it, as well as the general sense of influence on both sides, I think that would be really interesting for everybody.
Uh, yeah, gosh, that's interesting. Well, let me just say right off the top, I shouldn't be aware, and I am not aware of any particular intelligence report that landed in the White House, and whether it was one that scared the vice president or not. I will say though, and you always run a risk with somebody like me who's been around for so long, and I'm going to start telling you old war stories. But I will just mention briefly in that respect that I mentioned the very serious confrontation that took place in 2001, 2002, and I really thought that both sides were going to go to all-out war in May of 2002. And they say it was Rich Armitage, who was the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, who engaged in shuttle diplomacy to get both sides to back down. Well, the proximate reason for that was an intelligence analysis that was written in combination by myself and my counterpart in New Delhi, that is the CIA station chief in New Delhi, both of us predicting from our very different perspectives that the two sides were going to go to war, which got people's attention, to say the very least. They immediately dispatched Armitage out to the region to shuttle between the two capitals. The U.S. Embassy evacuated in in New Delhi. And at the suggestion of the U.S. government, U.S. businessmen in India began to depart en masse, they and their families. And so, as I say, that really got people's attention, very much to include the Indian government. Now, I don't want to say that we were primarily responsible for diffusing the situation, but I can well imagine, given my own experience, how an intelligence assessment may well have convinced the White House that this was a really, really serious situation. But I think that the quote from J.D. Vance in some way captures the ambiguity of of current policy. That I heard a wag the other day refer to current American foreign policy as being belligerent, unilateral, non-interventionism. So,
What
so
does that mean?
I think that to sort of square the circle on that, what I think the vice president was saying is, look, this is not our fight. We're certainly not going to make great sacrifices to get involved in a war which is not of our doing and in which we don't really have major interests. That said, we recognize that we have a great deal of influence, and maybe we at least ought to use it to the extent of making phone calls if we can, forestall a serious military engagement, which could have very serious repercussions for the region and indeed for the globe. So, but I think it sort of captures a very essential ambiguity in current American policy as we transfer from, if you will, sort of the U.S.-led international system that has existed since shortly after World War II to whatever it is that we are evolving toward now.
Yep, absolutely. You'll have to remind me offline what that wag said, because I already lost it a little bit, but that was a classic.
Yeah, but belligerent unilateral non-interventionism.
All right, we're going to be doing a session on that very subject in the near future. So
Yeah.
Bob, there's a ton of great questions coming in. As I've noted, some of them dovetail with what I've been wanting to ask you about. One,
Mhm.
I want to take it to a dark place, and I think we're alluding to it
Yeah.
here. The question of these two nuclear armed neighbors. One of the people who sent in the question I know is very deeply knowledgeable about U.S. military, global affairs as well. So
Mhm.
I'll build off of what he's asking, which is,
Mhm.
whether each side has a solid understanding of when their opponent is going to start generating the use of such forces, preparing to use nuclear weapons. Do they understand, do they have good insights into the preparations of the other side? A, and then B, what does it look like if there is some sort of limited exchange, God forbid, of nuclear weapons? I hear people talking about, well, this could be the end of the world as we know it. My understanding is that it would be horrendous, and there might be, radioactive clouds and all of that, but not quite
Mhm.
that situation. So this is a rather dark subject, but break it down for us a little bit what this might mean.
Yeah, let me just throw out a few thoughts there. One of the real difficulties in all of this is the asymmetry in conventional capabilities between the two sides. The Indian military, as we all know, in all respects, is much more powerful, much larger, much more powerful than the Pakistani military, and therefore the tendency, if there were to be a nuclear exchange, it would almost certainly be initiated by the Pakistani side. And I think that there is a pretty good general understanding on both sides of what the Pakistani red line would be, even if, as a tactical matter, it might be very difficult to pin down and define. Basically, what the Pakistanis have said is that the uh, if their ability to survive as an integral, independent nation were placed at risk, which many interpret to mean if there were a major and successful Indian assault across the border, probably in the area of Lahore, which ran the risk, or which, from the Pakistani point of view, ran the risk of dividing their country, separating it north from south, and and calling into question the survival of Pakistan as an integral state. That would then precipitate a nuclear exchange. And frankly, just from my own knowledge of the Pakistanis, if that were to come about, if they thought that the survival of the state was at risk, I do believe they would employ nuclear weapons. And I think that that's understood on the other side. As a practical matter, when exactly in the mind of people who are shrouded in the fog of war and are inclined to think the worst of the other side, when would they think that that line had been crossed? Nobody really quite knows. And therefore, it sort of behooves both sides not to allow the situation to escalate to that point. If there were such an exchange, I tend to agree with you. It would be horrendous in a humanitarian context. One can't even imagine the number of casualties that would be incurred on both sides. That said, this is not a World War I type of situation where both sides are locked into firm alliances that would then dictate that other nations become automatically involved. That is not the situation. And apart from the radiation effects and the other things that you referred to, I don't think that there would necessarily be I don't think it would precipitate World War III. But that said, it is almost unthinkable in terms of the enormity of what it would mean to both sides, and therefore is not something that either side should casually risk.
Yeah, pretty dark thoughts, obviously. And that's probably one of the reasons everyone is paying so much attention to this scary conflict. And not only nuclear armed, but the ambiguities that are underlying this that I think you expertly alluded to there. I want to challenge you here for a second, Bob. I want you to pretend that you're the chief security officer of a big corporation who has assets in India and or Pakistan, or maybe you're sending employees to attend a conference, visit other colleagues in South Asia. Many of the people that are with us today think about such things. I think you alluded to a really interesting point about, India invading and going towards Lahore and cutting the country off. Those kind of triggers are really interesting. If you were to theoretically put on your chief security officer hat, the head of travel at a big company, how would you be thinking about advising your colleagues right now about how to navigate risk and keep your employees safe in South Asia?
Yeah, I think different individuals and different organizations have different appetites for risk,
Yeah.
obviously. But I guess what I would say, just off the top, is that although the situation, if anything, I think is worsening and becoming a little bit more volatile because of the underlying politics that we've just been describing, I don't at all believe that the situation has fundamentally changed from the situation that we've had really since 2001. We've always been in a situation where on any given day there's the possibility of a terrorist outrage in Indian Kashmir or elsewhere in India, for that matter, to which India would feel compelled to respond militarily. So I would hope that both sides, at least for some period of time, have taken an important lesson from this most recent experience, since we've gone further along the escalatory ladder this time, certainly than we have, well, I guess maybe you could say since 1971, really, because of the number of military strikes that have taken place on both sides of the border. So I would hope that would give both sides pause. But if I were in charge of, say, corporate security for a company that had personnel and other assets in play in India, I don't think this would fundamentally, in fact, I know it would not fundamentally change my attitude with regard to the risk profile. That said, next time there is a serious attack, particularly against a civilian target inside India, I think I would probably suspend that upcoming conference. I'd hold off on that a little bit, and I might want to get some of my people out of the country. But I wouldn't advise a fundamental change in the risk assessment or the operational posture as a result of what's happening recently.
Yep. Excellent. Excellent. And I would just add to that, if you do have employees in South Asia or people planning to be there, now is a great time to think about your crisis management plans, your business continuity plans, updating
Indeed.
these different plans for emergencies. Give that some thought, rethink what your risk appetite is. We're always here for you at Interfor International if you want to chat about any of those things. Bob, I want to jump into an area I can see a few questions along this line in the Q&A section, and I wanted to ask you about it. Just who are these terrorists that attacked in India? Well, I'd love to learn a little bit more about them, their goals, and someone is asking specifically about the timing of the attack. I guess the location was known as Pahalgam, if I'm saying
Yes, that's right, Pahalgam. Yep.
So they're noting that the timing of the attack seemed rather curious to them. What do you assess the motivation was, and the motivation for the timing? And what do you think about the likelihood of a similar attack in the near term? And if it's not too much to unpack either, can you talk about the relationship of Pakistan's ISI to some of these players as well?
Yeah, boy, there's a lot there to unpack.
Mostly, who are these? What happened?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, sort of going back a little bit into to history, after the start of the Kashmir insurgency, it was very much it started out very much as an indigenous phenomenon, and it was led by Kashmiris based in Kashmir. That said, as their numbers dwindled through attrition over time, and as more Pakistani-based militants became directly involved, there was the relative importance of the Pakistani as opposed to the Kashmiri militants became greater. And essentially, Pakistani groups sort of took over the insurgency, if you will. And from my point of view, as a counterterrorism professional, I think it is very unfortunate that the Pakistanis in particular don't make a very sharp distinction between what we might regard as insurgent attacks against legitimate military targets and terrorist attacks as properly so called. That is, attacks that are launched against civilians for political purposes. Pahalgam was clearly a terrorist attack. And I think, fortunately, the Pakistan government, whether sincerely or otherwise, did denounce it as such. And I would point out as well that the popular reaction, very much to include Kashmiri Muslims to this attack, was very, very negative as well, which I think speaks well. That said, since then, over time, the degree of aggressiveness with which the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, has supported, promoted, and provided assistance to these Kashmiri groups, I think, has waxed and waned over time, in part due to pressure from India, pressure from the international community, very much to include the United States, but it has never entirely gone away. And in terms of the timing of this specific attack, honestly, I don't think anybody, absent, very, very well-sourced information, intelligence on this specific group, and these specific militants that were responsible for it, which I certainly don't have. I think it's very, very difficult for us to say. Some on the Pakistani side, looking at this and assuming that there must have been an official Pakistani hand in the timing, if not the execution of this attack. I've pointed to the fact that there was a recent attack on a train in Baluchistan, and it is widely thought that India has been involved in supporting Baluch militants who've been engaged in attacks against the Pakistani security forces and, in some degree, civilian targets as well in Baluchistan. I'll just say parenthetically that where I have tended to discount Indian involvement in these attacks over time, I think it's become more and more clear that there is at least some Indian role in that as well. And I suspect that that is part of an Indian effort to ratchet up pressure on the Pakistanis and to establish, what you had spoken of several times, and that is deterrence in the context of hostilities with India. Another thing that I'll point to here, though, which I think is an unfortunate development, is that if anything, I think at least the perception of Indian repression in Kashmir has increased over time. I mentioned the change in the constitutional status of Kashmir, which is a very big deal politically on the ground, including in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and the fact that there are efforts which are perceived, at least, to be indications that the Indian government is trying to change the demographic nature of the population inside Kashmir, and that has led to the formation of a number of relatively new secular-seeming groups, insurgent groups inside Kashmir. Now, I think it is widely assumed by many that the formation of these groups is actually an attempt that is in part being pressed by Pakistan and specifically the ISI to further hide its hand in Kashmir, and that while these people present themselves as secular-minded opponents of Indian occupation and repression, In fact, they're just fronts for the same old collection of militants who've been engaged in these attacks for the last 25 plus years. So I'm not sure. It may be a combination of the two, but I certainly lack the intelligence to make a firm judgment on that account. But what I will say is that in virtue of recent political developments in Indian-occupied Kashmir, I think that the chances of attacks certainly have not diminished in recent years and looking into the future.
Thank you for that really illuminating answer. There's a lot I did not know there. Bob, you and I have talked enough that I think that you will not be surprised that I want to bring this back to China and bring China into the mix here a little bit.
Right.
I want to talk about a question of specifically Chinese influence in Pakistan. Not only is Pakistan close to China, but India and China have had a border dispute for many years along the Himalayan border. And really, for the last 4 years, there's been a bit of a standoff there. And sometimes there's been some violence. Only recently did they reach some sort of agreement to kind of lower the tension there. But it's been a lot of pressure on the Indian army to maintain a state of readiness there. And India is also something of a natural rival to India in Asia, especially with all the politics going on today. I wonder if you could talk about the interests of China and its relationship to Pakistan and the role it's playing in this conflict here right now as well.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that there are other perspectives on this that I think are equally valid. I'm not sure that I have my arms fully around this, but as you mentioned, China is and remains a very close and increasingly important ally of Pakistan, financially, economically, militarily, diplomatically, and otherwise. And in fact, to the point where the Pakistani military, and very much to include the previous Chief of Army Staff, General Bajwa, was concerned lest Pakistan become completely reliant upon China. And I think for that reason, there are many in the Pak military, in particular, elsewhere in the Pak government, who would like to improve their relations with the United States, if for no other reason, so that they're not uni-tracked with China. The Chinese are a much more convenient ally than the United States. The Chinese don't lecture. The Chinese don't impose restrictions on how their weaponry is going to be used. Right. One thing I didn't mention before, but which I should have, was that the Pakistanis did not employ their F-16s in this recent confrontation with India. They just recently had a new agreement, I believe it was valued at $400 million for maintenance and upgrades to their F-16s. But they did not dare use them along the Indian border because of restrictions that have been placed by the United States. If they were doing combat patrols, they were well back of the border because the Americans have said that they can only use those aircraft for counterterrorism and for national defense purposes, and cannot be used aggressive, rather, what do I want to say? Aggressively against, and particularly against India. So that said, I think that China is somewhat burdened by its relationship with Pakistan. In recent decades, they've embarked on much closer economic cooperation. That they've established an economic corridor in Pakistan, the so-called CPAC, which they had hoped would generate a great deal of economic growth, which in turn would enable the Pakistanis to pay off their outstanding loans to China. It has not turned out that way. It has been a disappointment in terms of economic development. The Pakistanis are very much struggling fiscally, and China, to its regret, has had to roll over and refinance its outstanding loans to Pakistan on multiple occasions. So yes, I think the Chinese do in part see this as related to their tensions and their rivalry with India. And there's no indication that the Chinese are going to back away from their alliance with Pakistan. That said, it's not an easy alliance for them, and I think in some respects that they would probably like to see other international involvement, particularly fiscally, in Pakistan, that would relieve them of some of that burden.
Really interesting, Bob. I
Yeah,
definitely learned
yeah.
a lot
Well, and
there.
let me just say a little bit. As probably people can intuit by now, I know Pakistan a great deal better than I do India. But the Indians have been very clear that they have to be mindful of the military dependencies that they have to foreign powers, in particular the Russians. So at a time when the U.S. has wanted to see India participate actively in its program of sanctions on the Russians in the context of the war in Ukraine. The Indians have clearly refused to do that. They've continued to be a major purchaser of Russian oil, and they've said very, very clearly, look, we have dependencies on Russian resupply and maintenance of Russian weapons that still are very heavily represented in our inventory, and we don't dare put those at risk.
Interesting stuff, Bob. We're getting we're looking a bit towards the finish line here. We kind of play these by ear a little bit about how long we're going, but we have such a robust set of questions and interest here. I think we'll get pretty close to the hour mark here. What I want to try to do next is combine several questions that talk about the dynamics of what they call the Middle East dynamic. So, one question talked about wondering your thoughts on why Turkish drones on one side, Israeli on the other. Another talked about how, certain Middle East countries might see broader tension as an opportunity to become broader political players in the region. And then another question was about in the information war and the way that the Palestinians have been able to use disinformation, if you will, to, curry favor in other parts of the world. Can you comment on all of these dynamics? I know it's a lot there, Bob. I'll refresh if you need, but so let's talk a little. I know that your knowledge extends to the Middle East as well, so take that anywhere you'd like.
Yeah. I'm not sure I fully follow. You mentioned about possible Turkish involvement
Yeah, I think
in this dynamic?
some of the drones have been attributed on the Pakistani side to be
Right.
Turkish, and
Yeah.
the Indians are apparently using Israeli drones.
Yes. Yeah. That's absolutely right. Well, no, there has long been close cooperation, as I'm sure you know, between Israel and India, and I think that has a number of different components and aspects to it. And if anything, I think since the dawn of the so-called war on terror, that has tended to bring the two sides more closely together. I think they identify with one another in terms of being victims of terrorism and aggressively working against terrorism. And if you talk about, sort of, if you will, the information war, sort of the war of perceptions, I think one of the respects in which the Indians have been very successful is in framing their challenges vis-a-vis the Kashmir insurgency and Pakistani involvement in particular as a struggle against terrorism, and the underlying political aspects of this having to do with their posture in Kashmir, the perception that the Kashmiris are being repressed by the Indians. Last I saw it, my numbers aren't all that current, but I think that traditionally there've been a minimum of 800,000 Indian security forces deployed in the relatively small state of Jammu and Kashmir. So it is very much an aspect of the overall dynamic, and yet one which is, I think, sort of discounted, at least in terms of international perceptions. And I think that it has tended to remove some international pressure that might otherwise exist on India to try to find a peaceable solution that would involve concessions on both sides. And I think that if anything, this international perception has encouraged the view within India that we unilaterally are the victims here, and that we are entirely justified in taking whatever measures we need to take in order to protect ourselves against Pakistani-based extremists and militants.
Well, Bob, thank you for that. I think we're going to draw this to a close, but this has been an incredibly fascinating and I think really useful conversation. I hope everybody who's joined has found it to be exactly that. We will be distributing a recording of this conversation for anybody who wants to review this again or share the recording with anybody. But Bob, my friend, thank you so much for spending time with us. I've enjoyed this conversation very much. I hope everyone will join us on June 4th. I'm going to turn it over to Don Aviv, the CEO of Interfor International, excuse me, to wrap things up.
Thanks again, Bob and Jeremy. Great job all around. I hope everyone found it as informative as I did. Again, June 4th, we're going to have a great session with Mark Sullivan, former director of the U.S. Secret Service, and tackle other more domestic related issues. But again, stay safe, everyone. And if you have any follow-up questions for us or for Bob, send them in. We're happy to relay them and hopefully get you some answers. And we're always here if there are any concerns regarding travel, investigative, or intelligence support anywhere around the world. So thanks, everyone.